that if churches are going to make a constructive contribution as we go forward through these times of upheaval, we've got to be clear about what are the drivers, the causes behind where we are. Because we're seeing people turning inward, we're seeing a breakdown in social trust, but it's been a long time in the making. And really it's to do with decades of individualism, the individualistic society, which perhaps was a good response to what was happening in the 50s. It was necessary perhaps in the 60s, but it's gone too far. And we've seen extreme individualism on the right in terms of the way the economic system has been captured by neoliberalism, and we've seen it on the left as well as kind of social individualism, the me culture. So I think there's this bit, also this great de-alignment that's happening between the governed and those who govern us. And these fault lines that have come up over the last, say, 20 years at least, are now values divides. This is why our current political system is struggling to cope, because it's no longer really about left and right. The churches actually have a potential here to overcome the sort of binaries that we're seeing dividing the West.
Perhaps the biggest issue that Christians faced in relation to politics at the moment is that we've got this division between liberal globalizers on the one hand and increasing national populism on the other. And so what I think very, very strongly is that Christians shouldn't be on either the one side or the other. Now it seems to be more the standoff you're seeing between liberalism and populism seems somewhat to echo the 1930s. Now, during the 1930s, Christians in this country and in France, but Germany, articulated a very powerful alternative, which was often significantly associated with the term Christendom, by which they meant simply that Christianity should be a whole way of life. It should be, if you like, a whole politics. You know, good things happened through the 60s, but we do need to ask whether that started to inaugurate an over-individualism. And so since then, you've had cultural liberalism on the left, economic liberalism on the right. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's too embarrassing to embrace these two things both at once, but increasingly, I think what we're seeing is that they're converging, but now there's a huge reaction against it. So for that reason, I think it's very important in this circumstance that the church reasserts boldly that you need a transcendent vision. You need things like believing in the soul, the primacy of relationship. These things really matter.
As a church leader, as a charity leader, I am trying to learn the importance of keeping an independent voice that can speak above the noise. Some people might say, or even a few years ago, we might have said, well, should the church be doing that? Isn't that surely the job of the state? We are way past that point now. We have, as a church, to be there for when the state has failed. And we've seen it on several occasions over several themes. I also think that the church really needs, more than ever, to be a place of sanctuary. Not just a place of welcome, not just a place where the doors are open and people can have a cup of tea, but a place where people can find shelter and safety and know that the church is not going to fail them and is not going to let them down. The thing is, I realise about all the different projects that are going on in our communities, meeting all the different needs, but the thing that strikes me about all of them that they have in common is simply this: relationships, relationships, relationships. And we have got to get back to relating and journeying with people.
You know, what happened in Putney was vital, and what they were talking about in Putney is vital for us to retrieve and to live in, I think, because they spoke about a commonwealth. That was the concept that was involved. A commonwealth where essentially we've got to think that the wealth of the country was held in common. And this concept of the common good is, I think, really a vital one, because it's there in our political culture. So we've got the common law, which is something that needs to be retrieved. There's, as many of you have noticed, we actually have a House of Commons. You know, it is a Commons. we've got the common good, and also what we're living through is the besieging of the commons. I really love this idea of a sanctuary. And a sanctuary is a place where you defy the worldly powers. That's how I understand it. The power of money and the actual domination. It's a place of non-domination, a sanctuary, and a space. And that is directly linked to, I think, the idea of the commons. But what I would say here is that there needs to be, the Christianity offers a language and it offers a tradition that is absolutely vital for restoring place, restoring the integrity of relationships, and conceptualizing what the common good could look like.
You could put this the other way around. They could only recover as religious bodies now if they do get much more involved in the social and political sphere, if they try to show, both in theory and in practice, how they do actually have a transforming vision to offer. And in many ways, I think we're moving into an era where the laity are going to be more important than the clergy, and I can see evidence of that everywhere.
I think there's a kind of hunger now for, I suppose it's a story of responsibility, of people wanting to feel that they can make a contribution that matters. And so we talk about vocational responsibility, and we've put together a sort of curriculum, a workshop and a schools program and other things like that, which help people to find a role, a sense of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you sort of go back to the apostolic age and the church that emerges after the resurrection, it is an on-the-ground movement of change. And I think that we've got to get back to that. And I think that it's about us living deeply in place and staying, hanging around and hanging out with people and journeying with people.
You cannot understand this world without two concepts. One is sin and one is redemption. That unless you comprehend that we are all capable of hurting others, using others, and that thing, and that the antidote to that is grace, these are vital concepts for the resurrection of a democratic nation. There can be no redemption of citizenship without faith. Right, that's the fundamental thing, because it just reduces itself to a materialist secularism that degrades the person to a thing and nature to a commodity. The church is a fundamental representative of society. It's not an addition to the state. It's not there to provide services, but to provide redemption through community.
Well, actually, I think it's not just clearing up the mess of the state, but I think that the church has a role in challenging the structural sin that impacts people's lives on a daily basis, as well as dealing with the personal sin that we all grapple with as people of faith. But the critical element for society and for really making impactful change is what we might describe as the liberational element. But actually we want to see liberation, we want to see transformation of structures so that they work for people and not against people.
This is why, in a different way, I'm agreeing with Maurice that if you lose that religious dimension to identity and community, it becomes poisonous. Nobody should be just pursuing their self-interest or doing work to feed their family. That's never enough. I think if we have this idea of the primacy of society, the point is not that the church is doing charitable work that the state should be doing, but much more that all that sort of work needs to be mutual, reciprocal, and everybody should be involved with it. So it's not a sort of second best alternative, it's fundamental.
That kind of me culture, social individualism, has sort of morphed through a prism of a rights-based sort of grievance culture into an identity politics, where ironically it's actually undermining the uniqueness of the individual human person. Because the human person is a social being, somehow to reduce the person to somebody who's just a member of a group by virtue of their grievances is to really reduce us as a human being. I rather agree with you that the church is a kind of missed a trick here, really ought to be a force for unity and not taking sides. And actually, I feel that's where church leaders ought to be. They ought to be feeling the pain of a divided nation. I mean, Jesus wept of how divided we are and how contemptuous, mutually contemptuous people are. And, you know, I really despair sometimes seeing on Twitter some church leaders taking such a clear line on one side, usually one particular side, and so divorced from and disconnected from their own people.
So there are, you know, whatever you think about this, there are huge constitutional questions. I absolutely agree that the churches have totally failed to take you know, the implicitly religious concerns of a lot of people who voted Brexit, their worries about identity, their worries about the exploitation to both sides involved in immigration, this kind of liberal pieties that the church, I am a Remainer, but I do wholly reject these kind of liberal pieties that the church has uttered.
The thing in the Civil War and with the Putney debates was that there was something extraordinary that happened, is that previously illiterate peasants and working people, also artisans, read the Bible. And this is what the Levellers and the Diggers and the New Model Army in Putney were talking about, and they formed a different social base for politics, and they wanted an extension of democracy and participation.
There's this sense of us needing to tell a rehumanising story in which everyone is needed. We've got a situation now, we've got whole sections of society that aren't needed, that are easily discarded, that people are willing to live without. And there's actually a sort of rather worrying sort of sense that, depending on how things go, that people could just be ignored again. And I do think that the church, if we're able to get our act together and perhaps build some capacity where it's lacking, that we can help to contribute to pave the way towards a new settlement for the common good.
And I think that we've got to say quite boldly that it's the loss of actually, yes, that fully Catholic sense of what the church is, that it is a polity, that it is a process of mutual atonement, that in the end, by losing that, doesn't it look as if in the end the Western world is really losing its sense of the dignity of human life?
But I also think it was the subversive power of community. And when you read Acts chapter 2 and onwards from there, you see this underground movement that grows, and the authorities of the day just don't know what to do with it because people are daily coming and wanting to be part of it. We've got to get back to that. That's the kind of underground movement that people are looking for, not institutions that are just shrill, but people on the ground who are living radically differently for one another. And if we do that, maybe, just maybe, we might see change in our communities.